All right, my English teacher friends, Kristian Kuhn, also known as the Bob Ross of composition, coming at you with a really cool rhetorical analysis writing workshop. So I was asked by a number of teachers if I would tackle Tom Brady's halftime speech, and I missed this one. I'm not much of a football fan, but the 2023 season opener, Tom Brady gave quite a riveting speech. So that's what I'm going to tackle in this writing workshop. I'm going to start, as always, with a blank canvas, a la Bob Ross, and I'm going to fill it all up with my declarative thesis. I'll show you like 3 or 4 models for how to do the introductory paragraph. I'll proceed through the body paragraph syllogistically, and I'll even show you a few of my sentence stems. So strap in, sit up straight, and let's go for a ride. So this halftime speech you can find on YouTube. There are several versions. If you just type in 2023 Tom Brady halftime speech, you can see it there. Also, for convenience sake, I have put a link to the transcript. So the Boston Globe had a nice printout of the transcript, so I just cut and pasted that. There's a link there. And then if you want the very slides that you're looking at in this presentation so that you can host your own writing workshop, there's a link there, totally free for the taking, so have fun with it. So also, please subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet, and be kind, shower me with some love, and hit that like button. It helps the algorithm out so that more people can have access to my content. So I've already mentioned, Bob Rossing my instruction, and I often get asked what I mean by that. So let me unpack real quickly what I mean by that. So I think there's a seismic difference between the assigning of writing and the direct explicit teaching of it. So when I teach writing, I get to the proverbial easel and canvas, and I position myself as an expert writer in the classroom, just like Bob Ross always positioned himself as the expert painter. And I paint with my kids. I just put in air quotes, paint. So I write a number of introductory paragraphs. I write a number of body paragraphs. I show them how to do the conclusions. But here's the kicker. Bob Ross used a heuristic every single time he tackled a natural landscape, and it's known as the wet on wet technique. And for those that are familiar with my work, you know that I also embrace a number of templates that I've created over the course of my career. So for the introductory paragraph, we either declare or invert the thesis. And since we're doing rhetorical analysis, we're exclusively going to look at my declarative heuristic. And then body paragraphs across the expository modes are going to be written syllogistically. And then I got a couple of training wheel scaffolded stems for conclusion paragraphs. And that's what I mean by Bob Rossing your instruction. So please position yourself as the expert writer in the classroom. It really helps demystify things, and the quality of the writing just goes through the roof if you equip your kids with a good heuristic and some extensive modeling. So at this stage of the game, the canvas is completely empty, whether or not you're looking at a blank sheet of paper or a blank computer screen. So how do we fill it up? How do we go bit by bit and fill this up? Well, we got to ask ourselves the first question. How do I write the introductory paragraph? And here is another kicker. If you go back into College Board prompts for FRQ2, and what I mean by that is the rhetorical analysis prompts, there's sort of a hack or a cheat code embedded into those prompts, and it's this. You got 2 questions that are implicitly being asked of you, and if you answer both of them, you're going to have a rip-roaring good thesis statement. And the first question is this: what is the author's intent? And then the second, how does the author construct meaning? And what my students do is this. I call it the 3+1 paradigm. So whenever a student answers the question, how does the author construct meaning, that constitutes the thesis statement. So we're going to declare the thesis and answer that question first. But here's the kicker even further. I have my students take 3 sentences to answer that question. How does the author construct meaning? Because it's more than just one term or device. I want them to see how the terms, the devices, techniques link up with each other to construct the meaning. So I have them focus on like the 3 most salient, relevant, germane terms, devices, techniques in 3 sentences. And they lead with that, and then they slip in 1 sentence of authorial intent. So that's what I mean by 3 plus 1. And I'll unpack that a little more and give you plenty of exemplars and models. So what we did, just to kind of make things clear for you in terms of how I ran this, we viewed the speech 3 times. And then we read it 3 times on our own. And then together as a class, because it's early in our academic year, I did an exercise where we went term, device, technique hunting. Whenever students saw something really prevalent stand out in the speech, I had them write it on the easel. So kids would go to the board and they would write down ethos and explain, or they would write down enumeration, or they would talk about the syntactical flares that Brady used in the piece. So we kind of read it together because I know early in the academic year, the reading is not as advanced as I'd like it to be, but that's why I get paid the big bucks. So I got to help kids augment their reading and their writing skills. So graphically, let's break down what this declarative thesis looks like. I liken it to a triangle, right? Because the point of the triangle is up top, and oftentimes in argument we ask kids, what's your point, right? What's your point? What are you getting at? So you start with your point. You begin with the thesis. So I want my students to begin by answering the question, how does the author construct meaning? And that's going to take the space of 3 sentences. From there, they sprinkle in a little bit of context and background. And I want students to be very mindful of this, and I model this extensively. I don't want them to plot summarize the speech, right? I don't want them to regurgitate back to the reader what Tom Brady said. So ultimately, I'm just looking for authorial intent. Some teachers call it the exigence, the universal theme, the universal truth. That takes about 1 sentence. So there are other little bit parts that go in here. And one is tier 2 level vocabulary. What I mean by that is SAT caliber words, right? Augment the vocabulary just a tad because it's an academic task. And the College Board used to say that they wanted students to read, write, think, and speak like college sophomore English majors come time of the exam. And I still hold that expectation for my kids, which is why I run extensive word study academies throughout the course of the year, so that ultimately over time I see my students, if they give me an iota of effort, like exponentially their vocabs grow. Sentence constructs is another thing that I focus on. I really want my students to achieve a nice voice rhythm and flow. So we borrow heavily from Strunk and White's Write It Right, classic seminal text. And they have something called rule number 18, where they posit that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. So I don't want my students paralleling sentences in the introduction. I want them to be nice, supple, flowy, and to, have some syntactical flair and twist so that it doesn't read like da-dot, 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 da-dot. Often struggling and emerging writers overuse independent clauses and short, simple declaratives. So I want to break them of that habit. So I'm going to model how to do it. So let's recap. 3 plus 1. 3 sentences. How does the author construct meaning? 1 sentence. What is the authorial intent? All right, I filled up the canvas a little bit with an introduction. Let's see how I do this 3 plus 1 paradigm for the declarative heuristic. Here it is from the top. Again, note how I use the terms, the devices, the techniques right out of the gate to answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? Almost as if he cannot accept the spotlight placed upon him, Brady deflects the attention by shifting the focus onto the collective plural, right? So I'm going to focus on the syntax early on and the ethos. Humbly, again, more of his ethos, not wanting to make the moment about himself. He underscores that his accolades over a 2-decade span were impossible minus an incredible support system. Leaning on the employment of an aphora and amplification, so you can sometimes explicitly state the terms or implicitly state them. It doesn't really matter. He does not open the gift of the day as a singular person, but instead lets the entire audience share in the experience of their accomplishments. His successes are endless, but in enumerating a handful of them, it is significant that he pivots away from the singular. So you can see there, I focus on 3 of what I deem to be the most salient terms, devices, techniques. Again, you can imply, you can be explicit if you want to. I think it's more artful to imply, but I've found over the years sometimes AP readers don't quite pick up implication. So some students get penalized and don't get awarded the thesis point. So I encourage my students come time of the exam, be explicit, because readers get tired and their eyes are looking for terms, devices, techniques, and that kind of has their antennae up for, oh, that's the thesis. So a little bit of explicit, a little bit of implicit tends to get them the thesis point. Again, it's 4 sentences long. The tier 2 is really nice in this. You got deflect, spotlight, shifting, accolades, words like that, amplification. Just keep it good like that, enumerating, pivot. So I like to see that kind of diction in there without totally gooning out and sounding contrived and pretentious. I want kids to stay in their wheelhouse, stay in their lane, but also note how each sentence is different from the one that precedes it. That's what I mean by not paralleling the syntax. All right, if that's confusing and you're like scratching your head saying, what's this Kristian guy talking about? Let's do it again. So I typically paint this 3 times for my students. I find 3 times tends to be the magic number to demystify things. So again, I'm going to go 3 plus 1. 3 construction of meaning, 1 authorial intent for a total of 4 sentences. I'm going to sprinkle in some tier 2 and focus on those sentence constructs. With deliberate intent, Brady makes certain to not steal the spotlight, even though the moment is about him and his remarkable career. So again, I talk about the ethos. I think that's very important in the beginning of his speech. Acknowledging that personal successes are never singular in nature, he places great emphasis on the collective plural. So I'm going syntax there, the plural pronouns. In enumerating a few key accomplishments, Brady never makes it about himself. Through anaphora and amplification, he cannot underscore enough that his ceremony is really a collective celebration of the patriot nation and the countless people who made his stellar career possible. So this is the same old thing as number 1, right? 3 plus 1, the vocab's up, the sentence structures are nice and flowy and supple and fluid. And I do that every single time I write a rhetorical analysis introductory paragraph. Just declare the thesis. So ultimately what it comes down to is kids reading correctly. Come time of the exam, my students can intuitively, almost like inherently, instinctively write introductions like this because we've been practicing them for an entire calendar year. And so they'll know how to rip the intros really well. They're ultimately at the mercy of whether or not they can ascertain a text meaning. And that's another really cool thing about using heuristics. I find that I can spend a good amount of time teaching my kids how to read because the writing eventually takes care of itself. So let's do this one more time. Yes, you can. It might look difficult, but with practice, you certainly can do this. Number 3, canvas number 3. 3 plus 1, tier 2, sentence constructs. Construction of meaning, authorial intent. Even though the intent of this halftime ceremony is to laud Brady for his amazing career, he does everything in his power to not make the event exclusively about himself. Instead, he gathers the collective we into the spotlight and shares the stage with the countless people that enabled his successes. Humbly, he nonetheless accepts the honor while tipping his hat to everyone who considers themselves to be a patriot. Quite simply, he underscores the fact that there is no I in team. So you can see there, oftentimes what I do is I end with the authorial intent. And I think as cliche as it is, I just want to show my kids clearly, perhaps even in like a hyperbolic manner, what that authorial intent statement looks like. And I think everyone's heard that old adage, the cliche of there's no I in team. And that's basically what Tom Brady is saying in his speech. That's sort of the exigence or the universal theme or the universal truth. So I said it kind of corny in the end, but it's totally cool. All right. If you are painting with me, good place to pause. Have your students try their hand at a declarative thesis, and be brave, teachers. Try your hand at a couple too. Be the Bob Ross of composition. Position yourself as the expert writer in the classroom and give the declarative thesis a whirl. All right. We still got a whole bunch of blank canvas left. We have to ask ourselves next, because the intro's done. So how do I write the body paragraphs? And as I've already promised you guys, and I've alluded to this, we're going to bust out the syllogistic method, which is rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and they would often learn the art of oration, polemics, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling, and they throw out these juicy essential questions like, what is justice? And, you see that as the essential question of seminal texts like Plato's Republic, and the great philosophical think tankers would step to the proverbial mic and drop their definition of justice. And Aristotle is just like us composition teachers. He's like, why do some kids do this better than others? And ultimately, he had a eureka moment. He said, aha, the really gifted orators, those kids that rock killer arguments, they have a certain mathematical computative approach to it. And he called it the syllogism, right? It's just logic. So he broke it down into a formula, and he put it like this. Premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. We call this line of reasoning, and Aristotle called it cogency. So if I were to say premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. We're naturally going to conclude, right? Because it's just logical. Uh-oh, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for your dog. Your dog's going to die, right? That's just logic. And ultimately, good thinking translates into good writing. We're teaching our kids how to think on paper, because I think most kids have good noodles in their heads, and they're able to articulate what they want to write, but it's just a matter of getting it cogently down on paper. So what I've done is taken Aristotle's heuristic and turned it into a heuristic for rhetorical analysis. So let's take a look at how we break it down and qualify the parts. So the first premise is going to be an argument containing terms, devices, techniques. Here's what ultimately happens in writing. And again, you could go look at College Board samples and see this for yourself. Most kids, once they get into the body paragraphs, change the rules of the assignment and they begin to do plot analysis. And I'm like, no. You got to rock rhetorical analysis from top to bottom in this paper. So I want my students to take 3 sentences to create an argument using the terms, the devices, the techniques. And I'll model that for you in just a second. So it's always 3 sentences because I want them to keep the centrality of their argument. I don't want any College Board reader to say, this kid's doing plot summary, plot analysis. They're regurgitating the text, right? If you take 3 sentences and really get anchored in the terms, devices, techniques, the construction of meaning, students will not get accused of that. Second premise begins in the 4th sentence, and it's the textual support. I want to see a teeter-totter balance of the quoting and the paraphrasing. And then be mindful of this. You have to conclude body paragraphs. Like, you just can't run like hell and end on a quote. You have to really conclude it and make sure that everything's coming full circle. So I call it the link back to the prompt, the link back to the thesis, the echo, the promise of the first premise all comes there. Students often say, how many sentences should a body paragraph be? I shoot for 10 to 12 sentences. Those 4 or 5 sentence baggers that kids write, there's just not enough support or analysis in there to really flesh things out. And here is something that I'll say just to be clear on how my students do this. So I've taught lit and lang for over 20 years. And my students have always done 4 paragraphs on the exam for lit and lang. So intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. If you give them 10 to 12 sentences to really flesh out their ideas and advance their argument and substantiate their claims, they don't need that 3rd body paragraph. But if your kids are going to write 4 or 5 sentence baggers for their body paragraphs, it stands to reason they're going to need that 3rd body paragraph. But I don't know. I'm not a big fan of that. I don't think it's really good. So I'll show you an alternative way to do it. So what is a first premise? Kristian keeps talking about this. Well, here it is. Here's a look at it. One thing my students often ask me is this: where do I begin my analysis? And I say, begin right where Tom Brady begins. Like, have a chronology, have a sequence, go in like a methodical way through the speech. So I do give my kids a sentence clause, a sentence stem, to indicate that they have chronology. Some of them choose to use it. Some of them are like, that's kind of hoaxy. It's gimmicky. I don't need it. But I want my kids to indicate that they have a chronology. So simply saying something like right from the onset cues the reader into knowing that you have kind of a plan, a roadmap for your analysis. So to model for kids, I'm going to use right from the onset, comma. And then I'm just going to drop my terms, devices, techniques. Now, here's something that I want you to consider. Given that my students have 3 sentences to write this, they can multitask because it's really too dutiful and plodding to go 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph ethos, 1 paragraph syntax, right? I don't want them to do that. So if they can begin to see where the pieces unify and hold hands and link with each other, they're going to have some killer analysis. So look what my 3 sentences do here. Right from the onset, Brady acknowledges the emotional overwhelm of the moment. So pathos, emotion. But in doing so, he makes certain to place every single member of the audience, every member of the Patriot Nation, in a spotlight that exclusively intended to shine upon him on this day of celebration. As if to quell the rumors of a return from retirement, Brady also employs a touch of self-deprecating humor to put to rest any possibility of having one more stint with the team he called home for 20 years. All right, so I often say that the first premise is a promise. And I've promised to talk about certain things in the second premise. So I have to talk about the pathos. I have to talk about the ethos. And that's pretty much it. I don't think I really promised anything else in there, right? The idea of him not wanting the spotlight. I've set myself up to talk about the collective pronouns if I choose to in this body paragraph, right? Because I mentioned that he doesn't want the spotlight himself. He wants everyone in that stadium to come stand with him in the spotlight because he could not do things on his own, right? So just quick recap here. First premise, 3 sentences, right? So an argument using the terms, the devices, the techniques. So from here, what I do in terms of my literal construction of this is I go quote hunting. I look at the promises I made and I'm like, all right, I need a pathos quote or quotes and or paraphrases, and I need some ethos quotes and or paraphrases, and then I need to go look at those pronouns, right? This is what I mean by keeping the promise of the first premise. If you drop it in that first premise, you got to drop it in your second premise as well. So look at where I go with the fourth sentence, right? Fourth sentence indicates the transition into the second premise. So look where I go here. And again, keep the first premise in mind. Immediately, to acknowledge just how overwhelming the warm reception is, the famed quarterback takes a breath and exclaims, "What a day." So I usually tell my kids, get quoting in the fourth sentence, right? So that quote right there goes back to the first thing I mentioned in the first premise, which was the pathos, right? He comes out emotional right out of the gate in his speech. This gesture allows his fans to know just how appreciative he is of this very special occasion. But wanting to make clear that his career is in fact over, he half-heartedly reminds those fans who maintain a sliver of hope for a possible return that the run out was a little longer today than it used to be. He's not quite in game shape. Right. So in my first premise, I talked about the self-deprecating humor, right? And the idea that he wanted to quell any of the rumors of a return, because that's what Patriot Nation thought. A lot of people in the stadium that he was going to come out and say, "I'm back. I'm going to join Patriots and have one last stint with you guys." But they're like, no. We're gonna put his jersey in the Raptors, in a couple of weeks. He did 20 years here, and the career's done. So he makes that really manifestly known. One of the things I want to point out here are my quote transitions. There's kind of a heuristic within the heuristic, and I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational, right? So to be in contention for the sophistication point, you have to have silky smooth quote transitions. And in saying that, you got to teach your kids how to bracket. You'll notice when I model, I bracket a lot of things to keep that conversational nature. So I quoted, I got to analyze it. To put the kibosh on recent rumors that he is entertaining a return to the game of football, he gently suggests to the hopeful that he's beyond his prime and quite content with his decision to retire. Nonetheless, he knows that there is a certain nostalgia that everyone is clinging to, so he admits that it would be impossible for him to be in the stadium full of amazing fans and not beckon back the wistful days of yesteryears. From a rhetorical perspective, it is very important to note that Brady only uses the I pronoun on one occasion. So do you see that? I set myself up in the first premise to tackle syntax, even though I didn't say syntax. So I'm going to also get into his ethos right here as well. In fact, he deliberately enumerates everyone who made this day possible. Everyone from the owners of the Patriots, former teammates, fans, family, right? So you can also sprinkle in the other terms, devices, techniques as you're going along here. It's like a little checklist. So he uses enumeration a lot. So it's like, bink, I dropped it in there, and now I've got that covered. I've read the totality of the piece. Establishing his ethos so humbly is noteworthy because he spent his career underscoring an important aspect of football. There is no I in team, right? So that is my second premise. So you can see there, I got quotes and or paraphrases for everything that I promised in the first premise. And that's cogency, my friend. That's line of reasoning. But I'm not done. You can't end on a quote. You got to wrap this all up and throw a conclusion on it. So let's cross the finish line and just take 2 to 3 sentences to wrap this all up. That's all the conclusion needs. I typically do it in 2 sentences. Sometimes if I'm really deft, I can do it in one. No more than three. Otherwise, the kid's just kind of bloviating on. So in delineating a few of his more memorable accomplishments, like winning 6 rings, he never makes it about himself. Everyone who remotely entered Patriots Nation during his tenure is invited into the spotlight on this special day of commemoration. And I'm done. And you can see there in that syllogism, that line of reasoning is super locked in, man. That's utterly cogent. And that's what we want our students to do, right? Premise, conclusion. So it's a nice heuristic to really ensure that students set everything up nicely so that they can stay really bulletproof in their logic, systematic, calculative, methodic from top to bottom. All right, if you're writing with me, good place to pause. Have your students do the first premise, go quote hunting. Take 3 sentences for that first premise, sprinkle in the quotes and the paraphrases, and then wrap it all back. Echo, link, promise. But we still have a whole bunch of white space left. Kristian said that we're going to do 4 paragraphs, right? Intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. So what do you do next? We still have body paragraph number 2 to write. Well, it's that easy. You bust out another syllogism. So we're only at like the halfway point of the speech. So we got like the middle all the way to the end to still analyze. So what you're going to do is take a three sentences to throw other terms, devices, techniques. And one of the things with Brady's speech is the ethos is so important. So I still got to talk about that. The other thing is all the pronoun shifts in here. I still got to talk about that some more. And then he uses a number of times towards the bottom third and the end of the speech, anaphora and amplification. So I want to throw those into my first premise. And then what I'll do is I'll go quote hunting as soon as the first premise is written, so that I have the right quotes and paraphrases. I don't want to be willy-nilly and just quote dump because a stupid heuristic told me I needed quotes, right? Do it with purpose, do it with deliberation, and line it all up. Go for 10 to 12 sentences. All right. That's how I would do that third, the third paragraph. Now we got to throw a conclusion on it. We have to wrap this all up. And in my classroom, I have the following poster. It's just some conclusion stems that we use. And I get it. Conclusion stems are kind of gimmicky and a little too training wheel. But early in the year, some of my students feel the need to lean on these. But ultimately, I want them to concoct something a little bit more sophisticated than this. So simple conclusion stems like saying, simply said, comma, evidentially, in no other words, when it is all said and done, and at the end of the day. So we have a whole list of conclusion stems, but any of those work. And then here's one that I wrote just to model it for you. Sometimes students will end with the sentence stem, in a global sense, comma. In a global sense, Brady is the epitome of what it is to be the poster child for the perfect teammate. While his accolades are numerous and impressive, it's not just about him. A whole cast of characters enabled him to ascend into the pantheon of one of the NFL's greatest players of all time. So conclusions usually take 3 to 4 sentences. And at the end, I always tell my kids, it's like going to a 4th of July fireworks display. It's the grand finale, like really hammer the theme, the exigence, the universal truth, the pithiness of it in 3 to 4 sentences. So that's the whole essay, my friends. I am at the end. I filled up the canvas. Happy teaching, happy painting. I hope this served you well. And if you need to reach out to me with any questions, comments, concerns, even requests. So a number of people requested this particular writing workshop. I was unaware that Brady even gave this speech. Feel free to drop me a line at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com, and I'll be certain to respond to you. I also have a webpage, teachinghowtowrite.com. I'm a lead teacher for NWP, the National Writing Project. And as of late, I've been doing a little bit of work with NCTE, doing some presentations and things of that nature. So everything's free. And if you want to, do some PDs and attend some events, there's a calendar on there with the NWP links, the NCTE links. Give it a check, teachingwritingcoach.com. All right, that's it from here, and I'll see you at the next writing workshop.